doing today in fisheries management is we're using only information about what is happening today and extrapolating that to 30 years from now with no consideration to the fact that the Southern Ocean 30 years from now is not going to be the Southern Ocean that we're seeing today. We are on the Coney Island boardwalk. We're a 15-minute walk from my parents' house and where I was born and grew up. This beach in front of us and this aquarium behind us is a bit what started me wanting to be a marine biologist when I was 9 years old. My name is Gilda Cacavo, and I'm a marine biologist that studies climate change impacts and population dynamics of Antarctic fish. The epic story of Antarctic fish begins something like 35 million years ago when Antarctica becomes Antarctica in the sense that it separates from the rest of the continents. Antarctica is totally isolated from the rest of the planet. This new barrier forms, this Antarctic circumpolar current, that now isolates not only the continent, but the oceans around Antarctica and traps all of the species that happen to be on the wrong side of this barrier as it moves further and further south on the planet over millions of years. Most of the species that were living there were not able to persist. You can think of the story of the dinosaurs. Everything dies out except for a tiny class of animals, which become mammals, and then they take over the planet. In a little bit of the same way, Antarctic fish, this group called notothenioids, take over the Southern Ocean. The reason they were able to persist is because they were able to adapt to these new conditions. Over millions of years, they developed antifreeze proteins in their blood to allow them to persist in sub-zero temperatures, special adaptations to regulate their buoyancy. You have this crazy array of adaptations, and in this way, species were able to flourish and develop into hundreds of different species, an explosion of different types of species that took over all possible niches that were left to be filled in this incredibly unique environment, something that we haven't seen in any part of the planet for tens of millions of years. I started out as a neurobiologist and said to myself, how can I apply my training in genetics to conservation in the oceans? I use genetics as a tool to understand how species are experiencing the impacts of climate change. I, in particular, focus on this species called Antarctic toothfish.
It's sold as Chilean sea bass. It's the most lucrative fishery in the Southern Ocean, and there's only more interest in fishing for this species.
We can find Antarctic toothfish throughout the Antarctic, but where we know most about their life history comes from the Ross Sea. It starts with adult fish spawning over these seamounts that are located far offshore from the continental shelf at depths of 2,000 meters. And as the toothfish larvae are developing, they're floating up towards the surface. They're existing in this undersea ice environment. There's all these bits and shards of ice, almost like an ice forest, for young fish to develop, protected from larger predators. And as they grow, they get caught up in this incredible current system called the Ross Gyre, which moves them from these offshore seamounts towards the continental shelf. At this point, the fish are almost juveniles. And as they become larger, they're now starting to sink. And at the continental shelf, they're mostly inhabiting a seafloor habitat. They're growing, they're eating fat-rich prey, and over several years, they become buoyant once again. When they reach this neutral buoyancy, they catch that Ross Gyre again, which brings them back towards these offshore seamounts where the whole process can start again. It's a species whose life history relies on these vulnerable aspects of the Southern Ocean, sea ice and current systems. These aspects that are vulnerable to climate change impacts. The issue is that CAMLR management does not take into consideration climate change. And so we want to understand, in this context of fisheries pressure, what are the impacts of climate change now and in the future, and how can we integrate that into the management of that fishery. We start with DNA. We can get that from any number of sources, a little piece of tissue, even from the outside of fish ear bones that are collected as part of the fishery. Once we have this DNA, what we're able to do is sequence the entire genome of an individual fish. Now, this is something that 10 years ago would have cost $1,000 a fish. But with next generation sequencing technology, we're now able to sequence the entire genome of 100, 200 individual fish, and then mine that genome for adaptive change. We can compare the sequences of individuals to a reference genome, sort of standard for Antarctic toothfish. And then we can statistically analyze changes in the genome that derive from outside selection pressure, adaptive change. Antarctic fish didn't stop evolving 20 million years ago when the notothenioids were taking over the Southern Ocean. Genetic change never stops. It builds over time. Adaptation is a good thing. Adaptation allows species to become more attuned to their environment, but adaptation comes at a cost. We can think about adaptation as a signature of pressure, the pressure to adapt due to changes in the environment. What my work is trying to do is understand which populations are experiencing greater impacts from environmental change. We're actually measuring the adaptation that's taking place. We can then link this collection of changes in the genome to change in the environment. We can identify what environmental variables like temperature, like salinity, oceanic currents, loss of sea ice are driving that pressure to adapt. And once we identify the environmental factors that are influencing adaptive change, we can extrapolate from areas where we do have samples to populations that haven't been sampled, so that we have an idea of where adaptive pressure is taking place today, both in areas we can access and areas we can't. The next step is to then extrapolate that to the future. We have these incredibly powerful climate models that can tell us how is the Southern Ocean going to shift over time.
Bringing these models together with our research, we can predict key areas that we should protect, areas that become even more important to the species in the future.
When we talk about climate genomics in the Southern Ocean, this is state-of-the-art stuff. And this is work that we're going to start to see the results coming out in the next couple of years. Right now, we know with the incredible changes that we're seeing on the planet and in the Southern Ocean in particular, adaptation is taking place in all species throughout the Southern Ocean. That means that these are even more vulnerable populations, less able to deal with other pressures, pollution, increased pathogens, tourism, fishing, all of these pressures in their environment.
We can think of a connected ecosystem itself as a strand of DNA, and toothfish are integrally connected to that ecosystem in the Southern Ocean. Fisheries in the Southern Ocean are meant to be precautionary. That's just a fact of international law. We need to ask the question, how precautionary is a fishery in the Southern Ocean that doesn't take into account climate change? Unless we immediately reduce our emissions, climate change is coming whether we like it or not, and with devastating impacts. We have to work together to address these changes before they happen, and do everything we can to protect the ocean that sustains us and all life on Earth. And I believe that we can. Antarctica is not only unique for its ecosystems, it's unique for being one of the only places on Earth dedicated to peace, science, and international collaboration. All we have to do is take that forward and adapt.